All right, so this is a reminder, our exam is on Monday for exam 4. Anybody wants to go ahead and get started with questions or anything they want to go over specifically?
I haven't had much time. I've only been able to go through one of the cog books, but
Okay.
could you just go over the theory of competition, those equations, and then the graphs that correlate to them?
Sure.
That just seemed a little confusing with it all looks very different, all the different equations they give.
And I will say, I'll share my screen on this, but the equations are not going to be very important as a whole. You won't have to do any actual calculations on this exam. So all of these, I mean, it's important to know the background, and ultimately what we want to know is these right here, where N2 equals K1 divided by alpha. That's going to be important conceptually. Can anybody talk about what is alpha and why do we have it in this equation? It's a competition coefficient. Yeah, from the chat, alpha converts individuals of species 2 into the equivalent number of individuals of species 1. Exactly, right? Just by definition. So if we're here predicting the winner of competition and we want to know like which species is potentially going to win out, we can convert them 2 different species into units of 1 single species. And beta does the same thing, where that now converts the other species into species 2 into species 1, but versus species 1 into species 2. So knowing these, just these basic equations are going to be helpful, but just like I said, you're going to have to know them conceptually. And actually, I want to go over these specifically. I have some practice questions that I thought we could maybe go over as a group so we understand what's going on in these different figures. If we start with the basic ones, let's just talk about what's in these figures, right? First, before we get into any questions, what do we have on the X and Y axes of these equations?
The equations.
Sure, so there's going to be a conversion equation up here, and then the other conversion equation here. But what does the x-axis represent? Like, what are the units of the x and y axes? So let's start with the x-axis.
The number of species for just the number of animals in one species.
Yeah, and which species is that?
Species 1.
Yeah, right. So on the x-axis, we just have the number of individuals from N1 or species 1 or population 1, however we want to call it. And then what's on the y-axis then?
Number of species for N2.
Exactly, right? And then we mentioned we have the equation and we have carrying capacity also. That's what K1 and K2 are. So what we're going to be doing, if we can kind of see it visually, we're going to be either moving left to right or up and down, and those are going to take us where we're going to go on the isocline. So which figure is associated or focused on species 1?
A.
Yes. How do we know that?
Because it's labeled K1 on both sides.
Yeah, right. So we know that even though there's species 2 on here, we have species 1 down here. It has K1, the carrying capacity of species 1. And the same thing can be said for the other one, right? And that's how we know if we're going to go left or right or up or down, right? Because if we're going left or right, that also means we're focused on the x-axis, which is species 1. If the arrows are telling us up and down, that's the y-axis, and that's for species 2. And we can kind of think of these almost as bodies of water, like riverways. If we have, because what we're looking at is, say where my mouse is, that's kind of just a random spot, but that constitute a number for species 1 and a number for species 2. And why are we, if we drop it up here, why would we go to the left? Why are these arrows pushing to the left? What are the diagonal lines for in this figure?
Does that just shows the relationship between N2 and N1? So the closer to the left it is, the more N2 species there are for N1 species.
Well, I mean, you could be down here and be 0, 0 all the way to the left, right?
Yeah.
But what it's showing is it's called its isocline. And that's the interaction of species 1 with species 2. And what we have is essentially a winner's effect in these two figures. So what it means is if we drop it up here, we're above species 1's isocline. So it's going to push, the competition is going to push it to this line. And then it's going to go down here to species 1's carrying capacity. And what is the value of species 2 when we have species 1 at its carrying capacity here? How many individuals from species 2 exist when we're at species 1's carrying capacity?
0?
Yeah, it would drop to 0. Species 1 would increase and go up to its carrying capacity, and species 2 would go extinct. And then you would have the same effect over here, right? But it'd be for species 2. So now that we know what's the parameters and what is going on in here, let's practice answering some questions that you might see on the exam about it. So for number 1, what happens to population 2 or N2 as population 1 increases?
N2 decreases.
Yes, and why is that?
As you go further down the line, if you're going down the diagonal line, you're going further down and into the y-axis, and the further down you go, the less of each individual on the y-axis there is.
Yeah, right. So I mean, if we break it apart a little bit, when N1 increases, we have to go from left to right on this plot, right? But we have to do it in association with the isocline. So to go to the right, we have to go diagonally down this way. So this means we can follow the x-axis, N1 is increasing, but simultaneously we're going down, so N2 is decreasing, right? So this would be, as we said, a decrease. Now, what about number 2? So what happens to a population 2 as population 1 decreases?
It increases?
Yeah, because we're going in the opposite direction, right? So as population 1 decreases, we go to the left. So that would push us upward on the isocline like this. Population 2 would increase. And the closest thing you'll have to do to an actual equation with these or any math is just knowing what happens with beta or what happens with alpha. So for number 3, we could say what happens to population 2 as beta increases. And that's going to be using this equation down here.
Would that be population 2 increases?
Well, what happens, how do we get, so this is, we're concerned with population 2, so we'll use the right figure, right? And then if we want to talk about beta increasing, what numerical value of beta do we need to get to reach carrying capacity? Well, we can't divide by 0. We'd have K2 divided by 0, what can we divide K2 by to equal K2?
K2.
1.
Yeah, 1, right? I mean, that's the only number you would have to really know, right? So if we divide it, that's how we get it up here. Beta is 1, so we know the maximum value can be is 1, or the minimum value, sorry. Now, what if we increase it? We divide it by 2. Would K2 divided by 2 get bigger or smaller?
Smaller.
Right, and if it's 3, 4, 5, whatever, we know that it's going to go down, right? So as beta increases, K2 gets smaller, so we go down the isocline, so it decreases, right? Does that make sense why it would decrease with an increasing beta value?
Yeah.
Okay. And then what about, so what happens to population 1 if it's somewhere in the green? So population 1, species 1, we know we're going to be dealing with this figure. We drop it in the green. What happens to the population size? Yeah, it gets smaller because we drop it in anywhere. We go to the left until we hit the isocline. I mean, it could be down here and hit carrying capacity, or it could be up here and hit a smaller number. So we are overshooting, so we know that we have to go down to the left on the x-axis. Then what about population 2 if it's somewhere in the blue? So that would be population 2 is this figure, and if we drop it anywhere in here, it increases, right? Because the arrows are telling us we got to go up. We're in the below the isocline, so there's room for population growth, and it can go up until it hits that isocline. Yeah, so those are typical questions that you might see associated with this figure. But then there was also a little bit more complicated figures, right? What do these figures contain that the previous ones did not?
Both equations.
Yeah, both equations and both lines, right? So we have both species on here together. So this is showing their competition on a single chart. And what does the open circle represent?
Isn't that the species we're looking at?
Not necessarily, I mean, because we're looking at both species.
Okay.
Yeah, the equilibrium point, exactly, from the chat. So we're going to have different points of equilibrium. And this is, you can kind of think of these charts as who's going to win, right? So that's what we're predicting with competition, is which species would potentially win out. So if we look at figure A, which species is indicated that would likely win in a competitive scenario here?
K1.
Well, K1 is the carrying capacity of species 1.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's K2 on there too. So I think you're on the right track, but
So species 1?
yeah, it would be species 1. And why would that be in this instance?
Because equilibrium favors species 1.
Yeah, that's part of it for sure. So equilibrium is telling us that it's more likely to reach equilibrium when species 1 reaches its carrying capacity. And for species 1 to max out, reach its carrying capacity, it's going to drive species 2 to extinction. Well, there's another reason that we can visually see why species 1 would likely win out here.
Is it because that diagonal line is greater on both the x and y axis?
Exactly, right? It has a greater isocline, which allows it to have a greater carrying capacity. There can be more of these species, right? Because if we compare x to y, if we go to this value, we don't need to know what it is, but it's pretty far close to the edge. So it's a relatively high value on this chart for carrying capacity for species 1. And this is a more moderate value for carrying capacity of species 2. And then what we could also do is we could say, what if we, if we drop points anywhere, and we have two numerical values for species 1 and species 2, say we drop it in the green, the arrows are going to tell us what happens. That means that they both go down, right? Because we're above both species isoclines. Species 2 and species 1 are both going to decrease and head towards this isocline. But if we hit the blue, because the numbers both drop, it's going to tell us to go this direction, because we're now below species 1 isocline, so it has room to grow, but we're still above species 2 isocline, so it's still going to have to drop, and that's why it's going to drop this direction and goes towards species 1 carrying capacity. So species 1 would win out in this type of scenario, no matter where we drop it. If we drop in, say the numbers are down here, both species can grow, but when it reaches this, it's going to be above species 2 isocline and below species 1 and shift us down in this direction, and we're going to hit the carrying capacity of species 1, and species 2 then will go extinct. You will see some of these in multiple choice true false questions. And then we could use the same argument but different in this scenario, right? The isocline, it's switched. Species 2 isocline is above species 1, so all things are going to point to the middle and then towards species 2 winning out. But what's going on in C? We have 2 open circles. What does that mean?
It favors both species at their carrying capacity.
Yes, I think you're definitely on the right track. I don't know if I would use the word both, maybe either. It favors either. So this one's a kind of, I would say it's a depends. It depends where you start, right? Because there's a cross. If we start somewhere over here and we go down and go to this blue region, it's going to push towards species 2 winning out and species 1 going extinct. But say we start over here and it pushes us down into this blue region, then the arrows point this direction and it's pushing towards species 1. So this is really going to depend on the starting populations of both species. So this is just going to be simply maybe not a better competitor, but a numbers game. Who has more to start with in a given region, then they might win out. If they're pretty equal competitors, then numbers might matter. But up here, because the isoclines are different, you might have different levels of competition where species 2 is always going to win out or species 1 is always going to win out. Does that make sense, the difference between A and B with C?
Yeah.
Anybody
Now
else have any questions? Sorry, go ahead.
For B, why is K2 and K1 swapped then? Is that just because K2 is greater than K1?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, all it's really doing is following the line. Like K1 was over here, and then it just got pushed back to the left, meaning its carrying capacity decreased. And K2 did the opposite, right? Because the line got put up here, it got increased up the y-axis and just said that K2's carrying capacity is now larger. And it's all about flipping the isocline. So it went from purple being low, green being high, to green being low and purple being high. So just one competitor was better in this situation, and then the other one, competitor 2, was better. Then what about D? What's going on here? We notice there's only one place for equilibrium, but it's not on the edge. So what does that mean?
Does that just mean both species interact well with each other?
Yeah, and to an extent, but yeah, the words coming from the chat here, what we're looking for is they're able to coexist, right? They can both survive and live in an environment. When they do that, they're both below their carrying capacities, right? Because now you have 2 species coexisting, but not one doesn't drive the other to extinction. Yeah, so that's the basics of what's going on in these figures. But now let's think about maybe answer some questions about it. So number 1, which population, N1 or N2, has a greater carrying capacity in figure A? So N2 is on the y-axis and N1 is on the x-axis.
N1.
Yeah, N1, right? Because it's K1 is further out than K2. Right, so it'd just be N2. Actually, I lied. N1, sorry. You got me confused. Yeah, so it would just number 1. And then what about number 2? In which figure does population 2 always win out?
B.
Yeah, right. We already talked about it. B is it's going to win out because K2 is where equilibrium is going to be reached, and it has a higher isocline and a greater carrying capacity.
Yeah. What is going on today?
All right. Number 3. What is that? Under what conditions would population 1 win out in figure C? So we're looking right here. Where would we have to start for population 1 to win out?
Have to start over to the right in the green area.
Yeah, so if we started somewhere over here, we would drop in this way, right? So to the right of the intersection in the green. What about in the yellow?
You'd also need to start to the right of the intersection in the yellow.
Yeah, so somewhere down here, right? So basically anywhere we drew an imaginary line, anywhere to the right of that would be the place that species 1 would win out. Then for number 4, in which figure do we get a stable coexistence?
Hopefully they'll be better with you today.
In D, right?
I went to
Yeah, from the chat.
my
Okay.
knee is really bad. What about your eye? It was more.
So these are the type of questions that you can expect to see on the exam. Would be variations of this. Does anybody have any questions? Does any of this not make sense? Okay, if there's no questions, that's cool. There was another question in the chat that I want to go back to. So it asked if we could go over the density activity in T17. Pull those up. All right, so these can come in a few different ways or forms. So you might get a picture, something like this, where you have 2 species, A and B, and then it'll say, given this type of interaction, what should happen to species A if the density of species B increases? So the first thing I would do before answering the question itself is I would think about what's happening in this interaction. So what type of interaction are we seeing here from cockbooks? Yeah, this is a predation. So that's, the first answer I was looking for. And then we say A is the predator, B is the prey. So A is eating B. And then we can go to the question itself. So if the density of species B increases, what happens to A? So if the prey increases, what should happen to the density of the predator? It would increase, right? And I was going to ask why, because there's more food. Exactly. So if there's more food available, predators can consume more energy and convert that energy into offspring and produce more offspring. All right, let's try the next one. So first of all, what type of relationship do we think this is?
Mutualism.
Yeah, mutualism, right? And this is what a capybara and some type of bird. And the bird, what it does is it eats the bugs off of the type of rodent, and the bird gets food from it, and then the capybara gets rid of the pestiferous insects that are biting it. So they both benefit. So now if we go to the question, what should happen to species A? So what happens to the bird if the density of species B increases? Yeah, right. From the chat, it increases because basically for the bird, there's more food sources. There's more capybaras with more bugs on them, so more food for them to get. All right, let's try another one. So what's going on here? We have, it looks like two hippos fighting. What kind of relationship is this? A competition. So it says, what should happen to species A if the density of species B increases? Basically, this means what happens if there's more competitors around. Is competition a positive or is competition a negative?
A negative.
Yeah, it would decrease. And I would say it's kind of a weird question with the wording because they're the same species. So it would probably almost be better if they showed two different species competing. But if you know that competition is negative for both organisms involved, so if competition levels increase, density levels are probably going to decrease, even if it's the same species in the picture and they're asking about different species. Does that make sense what I'm getting at? Okay. And what about this one? What's going on in this picture? What kind of relationship is this? And what's happening in the picture? Well, it's very similar to predation. It's I would call it a form of predation, but Cogwitz has a more specific term for it. We've got, yeah, well, herbivore is part of it, yeah, and then herbivory, exactly. Look at that teamwork putting it together, right? We've got an elk right here feeding on plants. So we have herbivory going on. It's just a very specific type of predation that doesn't necessarily lead to the death of the prey. You can eat part of a plant and it can still live.
There was an example of turtles eating like a fruit or whatever, and like the seeds being dispersed better when that population of turtles existed. Can we assume that this happens with all plants or in herbivory? Or is that
We assume what happens?
this could be mutualism as well? Like the plant is getting dispersed because the elk is eating or whatever, and then, or can we not make that assumption?
I would say don't make that assumption because when we talk about herbivory, the answer is usually it depends because of exactly what you said. There's cases where it can be beneficial to both, and there's cases where it can be beneficial to one and negative to the other. So that's a really good point to bring up. But with a question, if it asks what should happen to species A, so the plants, if the density of species B increases? Yeah, so species A would decrease, but I think that that's a fair argument that you could potentially bring up. What if it's eating the seeds and dispersing it. But I think the difference is they eat more of the plant than they disperse, because if they eat the whole plant, the potential to kill it is there. But I think that's a fair point. Hogbooks leans heavily towards herbivory. In this case, if it's eating it, it would decrease it. But I think we can't make that assumption because it doesn't happen in all instances. So because it happens, say, less than 100% of the time, it would generally lead to a decrease. All right, well, what about the last one here? What type of relationship is going on here? Yeah, parasitism, right? Where the parasite is gaining a benefit by feeding on the host, and the host is losing some energy, and therefore, not gaining a benefit and losing. So we have a positive and a negative relationship. So then it asks, given this type of ecological interaction, what should happen to species A? So what happens to the host if the density of B increases? Yeah, it would decrease, right? Because it would have more and more negative effects and reduce the fitness of the host organism. Yeah, so then there's the picture type questions, and then I want to go over at least one more of wait. All right, let me go back. Or wait, is that a different? You said 3C, sorry, I have to go forward. Okay, let's go to. All right, so 3C second image. All right, so what this is these are bivalves, so type of like mollusk, and then these are a type of coral. So this is an aquatic setting, and I think that's fair. I had to look up and kind of figure out what these are too at one point. And what this is then is, if you see this picture, this is competition. So they're competing for space, and they're trying to the coral are kind of trying to squeeze out the bivalves there. But because the bivalves have a harder shell, if they get attached to a rock, the corals cannot physically push them out. I wanted to find the other. There's a different way they present these questions. So I wonder if it's in the other section. I have two of the same sections open. That's why I'm not finding differences. Give me a second. Okay, so another way that it presents changes in density and species interactions is through one of these types of relationships where you have multiple species and it shows what is the predator, right? The caterpillar eats the leaf, the chameleon eats the caterpillar, the snake eats the chameleon, and the mongoose eats the snake, right? So it might get a question that says, given this food chain, what would happen to the density of chameleons if the density of mongooses decreases, right? So if how would we go about solving that problem? Because there's a snake in between, right? The mongoose does not have direct effects on the chameleon in this instance.
Wouldn't the snake population increase and the chameleon population would decrease because of that?
Exactly. So that I was just going to try to talk about a strategy to ask these. So we know we have the mongoose and the chameleon. So you could start with the mongoose, right? So we're saying the mongoose population decreases. It's a predator to the snake. So the snake receives release from that predation pressure. So then the snake is able to increase its population. And if the snake's population increases, it's going to have an increased predation pressure on the chameleon and have a decrease, or the chameleon will decrease. It'll eat more chameleons. So that's the indirect effect that the mongoose would have on the chameleon, right? So it would be a decrease. And what about number 2? So what should happen to the density of caterpillars if the density of the mongoose increases? So we're going even further back, right? So we say the mongoose increases, what happens to the snake? Does its
The
density,
snake
Decreases.
population would decrease.
right, yeah, the snake's density would decrease. And if the snake's density then decreases, what happens to the chameleon's density?
The chameleon would increase.
Yep, and if the chameleon increases, what would happen to the caterpillar's density?
Decrease.
Yeah, exactly, it decreases, which leads to less caterpillars. Yeah, so this is this, we'll do one more, just make sure we're on the same page. So what would happen to the density of snakes if the density of leaves increases? So we have more foliage or more leaves moving up the food chain. What would that do for caterpillars?
Increase.
Yeah, we'd have more caterpillars. And what would that do for chameleons?
Increase.
Yeah, they have more chameleons, and if more chameleons are available, how would that affect snakes?
Increase.
Yeah, exactly. Would it be an increase? So if the bottom one increases, it's good for everybody. Everybody increases. If the bottom one decreases, it's bad for everybody. Everything decreases. Were there any other questions about the species interaction activities or any pictures maybe that we want to clarify what's going on?
The one with the mosquito, you said that the fitness goes down for the person. That doesn't, is that like disease oriented, or is that like just the fitness of the member period? How does that make, because the population overall, it could decrease due to disease or whatever, but I don't know.
I
Can you
think,
explain that one?
sure, with the mosquito one, I think that it could be, like you said, one reason could be disease. Another reason is it could be stress, right? You know, if there's just tons of mosquitoes around, usually it stresses the host being a human or being a deer out, and higher stress levels can lead to lower reproduction. It can lead to lower weight gain. So it could be any number of reasons. The important key is that it's a negative on the host, and the host receives a decreased fitness effect, and therefore overall for the population, it should probably reproduce at lower numbers with an increased parasite around.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Where do we want to go from here? Sure, so we want to go over the learning objectives, we can do that. Some of these are going to be from there, so I think we can go fast through a few of them. All right, so number one, this is going to be talking about species interaction. So define and explain each type of interaction between species, including competition, herbivory, mutualism, predation, and parasitism. So let's just go ahead and define it. How would we define a mutualism? Yeah, benefits all parties. And I would think of this in terms of fitness benefits. So is it going to benefit both? Is it going to benefit one or the other? Or is it going to be negative to both? Right? And we said mutualism is a benefit to both organisms involved. So both organisms receive a fitness benefit when together. What about competition? Yeah, one against the other. So we have two organisms competing against each other. What are they competing for? Or exactly, somebody said fighting for resources, right? So it's going to be two organisms competing for a limited resource. That's how we could define competition. Is that going to be, as far as like fitness, is that going to be a benefit for both, negative for both, or positive for one or the other? We have, someone said negative. Yeah, it's going to be negative for both. And why is that? Why isn't competition positive for one, the winner maybe, and negative for the other? Yeah, using energy. So that's exactly where I was thinking is there's a cost associated to both. And sometimes both are losers, right? The winner might beat up or kill its competitor, but it might get injured during the competition and it might die of disease or infection rather, and they both lose, right? So that's why it's negative. It's energy costly and it has risks involved. Maybe they win the competition for a female, say two lizards, but they're both so beat up that neither can mate with the lizard. So she goes and leaves them and mates with a third male. Yeah, so this would be negative for both. What about herbivory? What's going on with that? So just the herbivore benefits, I agree. But what happens in herbivory? Like what parties are involved? So animals feeding on plants. Yeah, you're going to have an organism, an herbivore, usually an animal that feeds on plants. Exactly. And that's going to be positive, as we said, for the herbivore generally, and negative for the plant. What about predation? What's going on there? So a predator-prey situation. So we have a predator and a prey. So this one organism kills and eats the other organism, right? How does that pan out for fitness benefits between? So it benefits one party only. And just so we're on the same page, which party is benefited? Right, the predator, and the prey is, its fitness goes, it stops or goes to 0, depending if it's reproduced or not. So it's negative on its fitness. Then what about parasitism? How do we describe what's happening for parasitism? So there's a parasite and there's a host, I would agree. What is the parasite? The parasite's feeding off the host. How is this different than herbivory? It can live on or in the host. It doesn't always have to. Well, would you argue that a deer needs plants to live? If someone said because parasites need a host to live, I agree with that. But this is getting slightly into semantics, but why the definitions are different. Someone said continuously. I mean, I could think with the mosquito example, they don't continuously feed off of you. So the females get one blood meal to reproduce, and then they can go fertilize their eggs or mature their eggs and fertilize them. Think about the organisms involved. What did we say had to be part of herbivory?
Plants.
Yeah, it has to be a plant, right? So that's what kind of makes herbivory specialized. You could call it specialized predation. And parasitism is different because it doesn't have to be a plant, right? It could be, an insect and a mammal, like a mosquito and a human. It's similar to herbivory because herbivory doesn't necessarily lead to the death of the plant, and parasitism generally doesn't lead to the death of the host. It can, but if the parasites killed all their hosts, like in predation, they wouldn't have any hosts left. They benefit if the host lives because it continues to give them, they can get repeated meals off of that host. Does that make sense how predation, herbivory, and parasitism are different? Yeah, so we said, so herbivory can only be plants. Sorry, let me scroll back up. While parasites can have any kind of host, including plants, but not, yeah, there could be parasites for plants, parasites for insects, parasites for animals. Yeah, that's the question, would the difference just be because of this? Yeah, so exactly, the types of organisms involved are gonna make it either herbivory, parasitism, and then predation, parasitism, or predation is, the key there is the prey does die in every instance. In herbivory, the prey can die. It also has to be a plant, but the prey can also live. Are there any questions about that? Those three similar relationships? Okay, if not, we can move on to number 2. So this one says, for each type of ecological interaction, again, talking about mutualism, competition, herbivory, predation, parasitism, defend the position that this interaction either 1, increases diversity, decreases diversity, or increases or decreases diversity, depending on the situation. All right, so for mutualism, what does that do for diversity? Yeah, mutualism is positive for both. So if it's a positive interaction, it generally in nature has an increase in diversity. What about competition?
It will increase the diversity of one, but not the other.
How would you defend that?
I would say like if there were two species that survived on a similar food source, and one outcompeted the other, one population would go down.
But if one population goes down, would that be an increase in diversity? Because that diversity is talking about like diversity of species.
No, it wouldn't be an increase in diversity.
So in competition, it's negative for both, right?
Right.
So if it's a dual negative, would we maybe think that, someone in the chat said it would decrease diversity. If it's a highly competitive, you're going to have some losers, so you're going to, and some winners. So if the losers die out or are kicked out of the area, then the diversity of that area would probably go down, right? So these are directly related to the number one, where it's positive, negative fitness benefits. That's generally also going to be the same pattern for increase or decrease diversity. So what about herbivory? This goes back to a question that was raised a little bit ago about the tortoises and the seeds. So again, this one exactly. Someone said this is going to depend on the situation. So it's going to be exactly like in the question with the tortoises. If they eat certain plants that they can spread the seeds, that could be positive and that could increase diversity potentially. But if they kill the plants, that's going to decrease diversity. So that's the depends part. What about predation? So we got two votes, 3 votes for decreases. Does anybody have a different stance on this one? So someone says depends. Now someone's asking if it would increase. So fair enough. This one's kind of an interesting one. And the answer is it depends. And what I want us to think about is keystone species. So what do top predators, if they don't, top predators don't tend to kill off all of their prey. And a lot of times what they do is they eat multiple prey. And if you have 2 competitors that are both prey to a predator, so they're lower in the food chain and they're equals, if that predator eats from both and prevents one population from growing really fast, or either population, it kind of keeps them in balance or keeps them in check. So a good example that it went through was the wolves of Yellowstone, right? It talked about how that could be a keystone species. And when they were removed, what happens is certain like meso or secondary predators like coyotes, those populations really took off. And those are really efficient predators with a limited amount of prey, and they killed off and lowered the population of lots of other organisms. But it could also decrease it if the predator is a very efficient predator and kills everything on the island, like an invasive species. That might decrease the diversity. So it's going to really depend on the situation, because if there's a positive and there's a negative, it could go potentially either way.
So it's more so to be positive if it's like a keystone species that's, keeping things balanced out versus an invasive species where it would decrease the diversity.
Yeah, an invasive species could come in and kill all sorts of species because they don't have any defenses against it. It's not a keystone species, and it can kind of throw that system in out of balance. Exactly. Now, what about parasitism? So we have 1/2 vote, I would say, for decreases. There's a question mark with it. But what is this one again? Is this a negative, negative, positive, 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 negative? Yeah, it's a positive, negative. So what have we been saying for the last couple positive negatives? Yeah, so this could depend on the situation. If it's a really nasty parasite, maybe again, an invasive parasite that comes in to say an island and these organisms can't deal with it, it could wipe out the organisms on that island. But if it's a common parasite that these organisms have lived with for, hundreds or thousands or whatever years and evolved adaptations for, it could actually keep, again, like a predator, it could keep certain populations in check and not allow certain populations to grow out of, very high, and not, which would allow them to outcompete other types of species. So what it can do is it can hold competitors in check and keep balance in the system. I would agree. My brain, if somebody tells me, like, if somebody told me I have a parasite, I'm going to think that's a negative thing. I'm never going to go, oh, maybe it's a positive. But in ecology, there are certain situations that it can be a positive. All right, are there any more questions about how these interactions can affect diversity? I say just honestly, the simple answer is pay attention to the plus minuses, but then the more complicated answer is remembering the why part. And that's really the important part. So. All right. So number 3 then, there's no more questions. It says, use Liebig's law of the minimum to explain how resources limit the growth of a population. So somebody want to take a shot at that or make one of the points from Liebig's law of the minimum?
Is it that the population will increase until the supply of the most limiting resource prevents it from increasing further?
Exactly, right? That's the Cogbook's definition. And let's break it down a little bit so we can talk about, there's some key points in there, right? The population will start to increase until the supply of the most limiting, right? So it's not all resources. There's many limiting resources an organism has, right? All organisms need water, all organisms need oxygen, but one is going to be more limiting than the other. And it's whatever is the most limiting is going to prevent them from increasing any further. That's kind of what sets the carrying capacity. So I'd say, are all resources that an organism uses, are they all limited?
Yes.
So in a terrestrial setting, is there any resource that you would consider to be more or less unlimited? So somebody said oxygen. Yeah, that was an example from Cogbooks. And I would say it depends. Like oxygen in a water setting, like an aquatic environment, that could be very limiting. But in a different scenario, such as terrestrial, we're really not, in most cases, limited. I can think maybe of a few minor cases if you're in a cave, right, that has a limited oxygen supply. So just sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on the situation. That makes sense?
I'm honestly a little lost on that part. The resources are limited at some point.
Under certain conditions, pretty much any resource can be limited. Under other conditions, they might not be limited. So if we're thinking about oxygen in an aquatic setting, if you're in a pond, say, oxygen, if there's no input of oxygen, you could be limited by oxygen. But if you're in the open in a field, you're more or less not going to be limited by oxygen because there's just so much in the environment that it wouldn't be limiting for an organism. But say you go into like a cave, that's a terrestrial setting, that could have, be cut off by water, and that could have a limitation of oxygen in there.
Okay, so it's depending on environment. Okay.
Yeah, so just think
Okay.
about, where the organism is and what would cause it to be limiting. Like if you're in a cave, there's no plants, there's no input of oxygen of any kind. If you're underwater, if you're in the ocean, oxygen's probably not going to be limiting because it's such a big body of water. There's so much plant life and algae that would produce oxygen, that you're not going to have, the ocean's not going to run out of oxygen short of some catastrophic event. Or if you're out in the open, say again, the sun during the day, if it's not cloudy, solar radiation is not really going to be limiting. But if it's at night, you're going to be away from solar radiation. If it's really cloudy, that could cause it to be limiting. So again, yeah, depending on the situation and the environment. Yeah, so in the chat, saying there's two examples we talked about, right? The cave, minimal plants could decrease a population. Yeah, if there's not if oxygen is being consumed at a higher rate than it's being pumped into the environment, it would decrease the population. But if oxygen is being consumed at a lower rate than is being pumped in, such as the oceans, it won't limit a population or decrease a population. Exactly. What is a major assumption of Liebig's law of the minimum concerning resources? What does it say about thinking about two resources together, like oxygen and water, and their interactive effects? So instead, resources have an independent, yeah, it assumes they're independent. It assumes there are no interactive effects, that there is one ultimate limiting resource. And would we say, is this always true, that there's always one resource only that's driving some of these patterns of growth? Someone said no. What's an example that Cogbooks used that they show that there was a good interactive effect of two resources? So it was a plant study. Yeah, plants being fertilized. And what was the other resource that they changed? Yeah, so they had fertilized and non-fertilized. So fertilizer or food being a resource. And then what was the second resource involved in that study? What else do plants need to live? They kept, water's true, but they kept water the same. Yeah, they messed with the amount of light, right? So they had fertilized high light, fertilized low light, unfertilized high light, unfertilized low light, and saw that there were actual interactive effects that both could affect the growth and development of these plants. So with this one, understanding what Liebig's law of the minimum says and what it assumes, but also being able to argue that it's a generality, but it's not always absolutely true, right? Are there any other questions or comments about Liebig's law of the minimum? All right. And then number 4 says use mathematical or graphical model to predict the outcome of competition between species. So for this one, this is going to be related to what we went over earlier. So I don't think we already went over these questions and these plots. And I will say, don't worry about the math side very much at all. I mean, understanding what the parameters are in the equations is useful, but you're not going to be asked to calculate anything. And you're not really going to be asked about the equations at all. Just visually being able to tell what's going on in these figures, or being able to describe and answer questions what's going on in these figures. So does anybody have any new questions that we didn't go over before about these types of figures? Or are we good to move on? Or
So this is both an example of the mathematical and the graphical.
Yeah. And I'd say focus on the graphical and much less on the mathematical. All right, so we'll go over the top one again. All right, so these are, let's say, like focusing on one species at a time, right? So this is, and we know that this is going to be focused on species one because it's got the carrying capacity for species one and the conversion factor to make species two into units of species one. And then the opposite for this one, we know it's species two because it has the carrying capacity of species two and the conversion factor of species one into units of species two, right? And just knowing from these example questions, kind of what's going on, like if we drop in the blue, we're below the isocline, so it can increase in number. And the reason we would move to the right is because we're focused on the species one, which is on the x-axis, and that pushes us towards the isocline. We have room for growth in the population until the growth reaches its carrying capacity and maxes out. And the opposite is if we start with a number up here, it means we're above the population isocline and it needs to decrease in density. So that's why it pushes it to the left, which could still push it to its carrying capacity. But it's always going to be a decreased value in the above it and an increased value below it. Does that make sense how to kind of read these top figures? Okay, cool. All right. Number 5 then. So this says, identify the members of a food web, including primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, etc. So why don't we just kind of go ahead and define these? What is a primary producer? What type of organisms do we think of when we think of primary producers?
Is it plants?
Yeah, I would say plants. Yep, definitely. What do plants do to produce energy? Yeah, they photosynthesize. And in simplest way, without thinking of don't worry about the chemical formula, but what do they use during photosynthesis to make energy? What products?
Sunlight and carbon dioxide?
Yeah, so they use carbon dioxide and light to produce energy, and they're typically plants. They're the producers. What about consumers? How would we describe those? What are primary consumers?
Would that be something like an insect that eats the plants?
Yeah, so a species or organism that eats primary producers, right? So just moving one level up the food chain. And it could be an insect, could be something like zooplankton that eats algae. So like smaller organisms, usually invertebrates. So somebody said herbivores, and then I think we're getting ahead of ourselves, like, because now we have secondary consumers. What is a secondary consumer? What do they eat?
The primary consumers?
Yeah, what would be some examples of those?
A bird that eats a caterpillar?
Yeah, or for the example we said, it could be a bird that eats the snails or something. Small fish that eat zooplankton. And then what's a tertiary consumer? Yeah, one step up, right? We're just moving up the food chain. So what do the tertiary consumers eat? Yeah, the secondary consumers, right? So if we said an example was a small fish, maybe that eats zooplankton, it could be a large fish that eats the small fish. So these are tend to be like the top predators. So I think that was pretty straightforward. We just identified all of the groups in a food web and just knowing how they're linked together and what level they eat at. And I'd say, most of the time tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers. Are there going to be examples where they eat primary consumers and maybe even possibly indirectly eat primary producers? Yeah, it's possible. But I'd say the main thing is they go back one level, and that's their higher level of what they eat. And then they eat smaller amounts of the lower levels. All right, so number 6 then says, wait. Okay, no worries. So someone asked an example of tertiary. So the example from Cogbooks is a large fish eating a smaller fish. Because we said that a secondary could be a small fish that eats zooplankton. And then going back, zooplankton would eat algae. All right, the number 6 then says predict the effects of changing the density of a species on other species in a food chain or food web. So we went over some of these examples. I'm just going to throw the screen back up, just make sure we remember. Oops, wrong button. All right, so you'd have examples like this, right? Where you're given an ecological interaction, and then you're usually going to have 2 organisms labeled A and B, and then it's going to ask you what happens to species A. In this case, it looks like a dragonfly. What happens to the dragonfly species if the density of species B decreases, so spiders. So remember we said the way I would recommend tackling these is first state what's going on. You have a spider eating a dragonfly. So that looks like a predation type interaction. So there's going to be a positive and a negative. And then it says, what happens to species A, the prey, if the density of species B increases? So if we have an increase in the number of predators, what's going to happen to the number of prey? Oh, sorry, I read the question wrong. It says that predators are going to decrease. So we have less predators. How is that going to affect the population or the density of the prey? Yeah, there's less predation pressure, so they're going to be able to increase, right? So are there any other specifics that anybody wanted to go over from these exercises? Because we did these a little bit ago tonight. I'm happy to do more, but if not, if we think we have a good understanding on this type of question, I think we can move on. Just let me know what you want to do. Okay, if there's no more questions on that, we can go ahead. Am I clear now? Okay. Yes, I was just saying, if anybody wants to do more exercises, because before we started going through these topics, we did go through several of those exercises, but there's even more, I know. So if anybody wants to go over any specific ones or has questions about them, we can talk more about it. Just let me know. Otherwise, we could move on. Okay, got 1 vote for move on. So sounds good. So the next one, then 7, says distinguish between different types of mutualistic relationships, including specialized versus generalized and obligate versus facultative. All right, so why don't we go ahead and just define the 4 of these kind of on their own. So what are we talking about when we say a generalist species? As far as a mutualistic relationship.
A species that interacts with many other species.
Yeah, and what would we think of maybe as an example?
A deer.
What would it be, have a mutualistic relationship with? What would be the, well, we have to think of two organisms. So organism one, deer, possibly. What would be the second organism that it has a mutualistic relationship with?
Okay, maybe not a deer.
I mean, a deer could work. So somebody said, could birds work? I would argue, put those two together, right? A deer and a bird could have a mutualistic relationship, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
like the capybara and the bird. So if a deer has the same relationship, and I'm not saying this is 100% factual, but this is a hypothetical situation. The bird could feed off of the deer, but maybe the bird is the generalist and it feeds on a moose, it feeds on cows, it feeds on pigs, it feeds off of all sorts of other animals, right?
There was one example, I think, in cod books about a deer in Africa that the birds would eat the ticks and things off of their body. Would that be an example of this?
That would be a mutualist relationship, but we'd have to then say one of the species would have to, like the bird would probably be the easiest example to say it eats off of several species of ungulate. So it has a mutualist relationship with ungulates, but it can eat off of different kinds of ungulates. So it's not a specialist, it's a generalist. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. Thank you.
So I was catching up on the chat. I wasn't asking for a generalist example at the time. But we'll get to this example in the chat in a moment. Let's just talk about, let's go down to the next word and let's define a specialist. What is that in terms of a mutualistic relationship? So we can think of terms, say we have one organism that is a specialist. Does it interact with one or a few species, or does it interact with multiple species? Right, so it's going to be a few. A generalist is the one we just kind of described, would be that bird would interact with multiple other species, but maybe we have a different bird that interacts only with one type of deer, right? It has a specialist relationship. So someone said the yucca plant and the yucca moth is what comes to mind. Yeah, if they're only interacting together, then that would be a specialist type relationship. So someone said, would bees be specialists? When I think of bees, I would think of them as more of a generalist, because bees tend to go to more than one type of flower, so different species of plants. But I'm sure you could probably find an example if there is a type of bee that goes to only one type of plant, then that would be a specialist, or maybe only 2 or 3 types of plants. So it's kind of a loose definition of how many organisms they interact with. The fewer, the more specialized, the more generalized. We tend to put these in a binary response. If that's a specialist, that's a generalist, but it is kind of more a spectrum where we have some species that are, we would say they're more generalist than a different species, and some are more specialized than other species. All right, what about the next? What's an obligate mutualist?
When two species depend on each other for survival?
Yeah, so two species depend on each other for survival, and they provide a fitness benefit to each other, right? I think someone had something about this in the chat. It's like a two worm providing a place for bacteria to live. Yeah, if the bacteria can only be found in this type of tube worm, and they both benefit from each other, so maybe the tube worm provides shelter, and then the bacteria provides some type of nutrient that the tube worm needs, that could be an obligate mutualist. And if you remove one from the relationship, then they'll die. So that's how you know that they would be an obligate mutualist. What about a facultative mutualist?
Where one species can survive without the other?
Yeah, or in most cases, both species can survive without each other. So it's just two species that when they interact, they provide a fitness benefit to each other, but it's not critical for their survival. So can we think of an example from cogbooks? It was a facultative mutualist.
Is it the humans in Africa that would follow the birds to the honeybees? And the honeybees would get to eat the wax and the larvae, and the humans would get the honey?
I think that was in an example in cogbooks. I don't remember the exact details of that study, but yeah, so they both gain a benefit. So someone said coyotes and badgers. If you want to go, I'm unfamiliar with that example. I think it's where they kind of hunt together, right? Where the badgers, yeah, so the badgers kind of dig up animals that are underground, and if it escapes the badger, the coyote can eat it, and the coyote kind of can smell out, I think, the prey a little bit better. So they use each other kind of as hunting partners and tend to do better when they hunt together. But if they hunted isolated, they would still survive. So I think that's what the badger and the coyote story is. The one from cogbooks that I have in my notes is the ants in the acacia trees, right? So the ants live in the acacia tree. They protect it from other like herbivores or other insects. And in exchange, they get food from the tree. But they've done studies where they remove the ants and have them live somewhere else, and they survive just fine. And the acacia trees, if they have ants removed from them, they also can survive without the ants. So that's how we know that, you know, they do better. So like the tree will grow bigger and faster with the ants present, and the ant colonies can grow bigger and faster as well when combined. But when separate, they have, although they might have like a slowed growth or a smaller colony or smaller tree, they don't die out. So that's how we know it's facultative and not obligate. Are there any other questions about general specialist or obligate facultative relationships? All right, now we can move on to number 8. This one says, explain how interactions between predators and prey can result in cycles of population size. So someone says that when the density of one increases, the other may increase, decrease like we did earlier. Yeah, so these are going to be the cycles, or the, you know, population density cycles. So from Cogbooks, I think this is a good representation of the predator-prey cycles. And the one thing to know is they don't, these lines in the figure, they don't overlap, right? The two humps are not on top of each other. And that's because of time lags, because it takes time for populations to increase and decrease in size, right? So if we have when we have a decrease in predators, we have the opposite effect. We have an increase in prey because they have the decreased predation pressure. But then when the prey increases to a certain level, predators can rebound and they can increase. And when they start to increase, that's going to cause a decrease in the prey, and you're going to have these differing cycles. And then this box up here is a really good point to talk about what's happening in the current time frame to both the prey and the predator as far as population cycles, right? And prey populations go up when predator populations go down because there's less predators eating them. And when prey go up, that gives more food for the predators so they can eat more food and reproduce at higher levels. But because they have this interaction, it's going to have, you know, the predators are going to decrease the prey, which then are going to decrease the predators. And this cycle is going to continue to go up and down as long as they keep interacting. This is from Module 4, T16, the trajectories of predator-prey systems. We have any questions on what's going on or why the cycle is the way it is? I'll just say, don't worry too much about if there's, you know, there's math, and I think there's the Lock-Volterra models. Focus on the conceptual side of those and don't worry about calculating anything. It'd be more important to describe these patterns right here than it would be to predict what the numbers of a hypothetical population would be using the Lock-Volterra model. So someone said, will be another cheat sheet? So no, for this exam, there won't be a cheat sheet. As I said, there's no math that you're going to have to do, so you don't have to memorize any of the equations. You just have to understand conceptually what's going on in a predator-prey cycle. No worries. It's good to ask and clarify again for everybody so we're all on the same page. I hadn't planned on hosting office hours on Monday since that's your exam day. And I wouldn't be able to do it until the evening because I work during the day. But if people would like me to host it in the early evening on Monday, I can do another more specialized office hours. Yeah, so this exam is going to be almost purely conceptual. It said there will be no mathematical calculations. The most math you would have to do is knowing when to divide carrying capacity by 1 to get carrying capacity. That's the most math heavy you would get. And knowing when you change the sizes of carrying capacity, so the alpha and beta that we talked about earlier, just the general patterns. If it increases or decreases, would one population increase or decrease? And you can do that without writing any numbers down or a calculator. So yeah, just knowing it conceptually and the patterns. All right, are there any other questions about the predator-prey interactions? I think the key thing is just knowing where we are in the cycle, you know, where if one population's high, one is low, is which one's increasing and what will that do to the other one, or which one is decreasing and what will that do to the other population? All right, so for number 9, this one says, given a photo of 2 species interacting, identify the type of interaction and its direct effect on each species. So these were from the, yeah, so these are going to be exactly like the activities in cogbooks, right? So you're going to have, let me pull these back up real quick. These are all the density populations. All right, so you might get similar pictures like we saw this buried fish earlier, but the question's different. So I might say, what are the direct effects of the interaction between these organisms? So first, let's identify what type of interaction are we having here.
Predation.
Yeah, right. So this is a predation. A is the predator, B is the prey. So what are the direct effects on A and B? And these are going to be in terms of positive and negative. Is this interaction positive for A or negative for A?
Positive.
Yeah, it's
And
positive,
negative
right?
for B.
Yeah, negative. And why is it positive for A?
He's getting energy from that resource. B.
Yeah, A is getting the food, so exactly, it's gaining energy. Why is it negative for B?
It's dead.
Yeah, because B is dying, right? So its fitness is going to cease or go to 0. And A is going to gain energy, which could potentially increase its fitness. So it's getting a fitness benefit for A and a negative fitness effect for B. And then these are all the same pictures, but same idea. Like, what are the direct and, if we talk about this picture right here, what do we have going on?
Competition.
Yeah, we have competition with A and B. How what do we say about competition?
It's negative for all parties.
Yeah, it's negative for both. Remember why it's negative for both? There are a couple of reasons.
Because they could both end up injured and it would affect the fitness of both of them.
Yeah, so worst case scenario, they both hurt each other so bad that they both die, right? So it's kind of like the negative of predator, right? So they both could potentially die. Even if one wins, it could get injured or it could die of an infection from a wound. Yeah, they both have to expend probably a fair amount of energy fighting each other. And while they're fighting, it might lead to missed opportunities. There's species of lizards where there's, 2 dominant males will fight over a female. And while they're engaged in fighting, smaller males will actually come out and mate with the female and run away before those dominant males even know what happened. So there's a missed opportunity of reproduction because they engaged in this competition. Were there any other questions or examples that we wanted to go over from Cogbook specifically, or we feeling good on those? Or okay, yeah, and with those activities, you can say that you don't understand it, and it will actually give you more activities to potentially do too. So is the primary consumer producer definition, is that T17? Let me check my notes to confirm with that. So I think that'll be in the trophic levels is the name of the activity. Yeah, so that's module 4 T17, and the tab that goes over this is called trophic levels. Probably. That was number 9. All right, so number 10. So this says use data on the distributions of species in a community to determine whether these species are independent or interdependent. So why don't we first just define the two terms? What is an interdependent community?
Is it a community where everything relies on each other to survive?
Yeah, so where you have members of the community that depend on each other to exist, exactly. Then what is an independent community? Can exist without interaction from each other. Yeah, so you have species that are in a community, but they don't depend on each other to survive. So kind of the opposite of what we said for interdependent. How would you know that, visually, if you walked through, say, a couple patches of forest and surveyed the plants, what would be some indication that you have an interdependent community?
Maybe you would see plants growing on other plants.
What do you mean by growing on other plants?
Like mosses or something like that.
Sure, I think that could get us started in the right direction. So you're seeing at least a moss and another plant together, right? So at least 2 plants in that example are together. And say you went to 6 different forest patches. Would you expect to see that pair always together and say maybe like 3 or 4 of the patches? Or would you think that maybe 3 of the patches they're together and 3 of the patches they're separate, where one's present but the other is not?
I don't know.
Well, we're saying that they're interdependent, right? And we say that they need each other to live. So would you ever expect to find those plants isolated from each other?
Yes, I would. Okay, I get, yes. Yes,
But you,
they would be
if
isolated.
they do require each other to live, you would expect to find them separated from each other?
No, no. So maybe that was not a good example then.
Okay, maybe another way to think about it is a way that I think they've studied this is through transects up the side of mountains, right? So as you tend to go up in elevation, the wildlife changes, right, with elevation. It could be plants, insects, or animals, or anything. But for this example, let's think about plants. As you walk up the mountain, you're seeing 2 plants together, and you go to the next ecosystem. Would you expect to see both of them there together, neither of them together, or just one of them? So somebody said both. Yeah, and the answer could be you would either expect to see them both together again or both absent, right? They should not be isolated if they're interdependent and they depend on each other. They should appear together and they should disappear together. Is that making sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so if they're independent, right? At the low elevation, you might see species A, and then you go up to elevation 2 and you see A and B, and then you go up to elevation 3 and you see 2 and 4, or something like that, where they start appearing independently and disappearing independently because they don't need each other to survive. They just need a particular elevation or environment to survive in. Yeah, so interdependent, rely on each other, appear together, or not at all. Exactly, I think that sums it up great. So in the chat, if they are independent, the species are at different elevations on the data chart. Yes, if they are interdependent, they appear on the same elevation on a data chart. Yes, I would agree with that too. Are we clear on interdependent versus independent, or do we want to spend a little more time on this one?
No, I think I understand it now.
And then there is a example in Cogbooks. So I just want to find that quickly if I can, so we can visualize what they're talking about. So this is in module 4 T18, and the title is Do Species in a Community Depend on Each Other? And this would be a figure right here where they looked at the abundance of trees on the y-axis, and each line represents a different species of tree. And then on the x-axis, they also looked at a moisture gradient. So they went from moist to dry. And then they looked at, the thing to look at is, when do these organisms peak, right? If an organism peaks here and this purple one peaks over here, would you argue that those two organisms would be interdependent or independent?
Those species would be independent
I would agree. And why would we say that?
because it looks like they don't gradually increase or decrease together.
Exactly. Their peaks are very separate or independent from each other, right? This is peaking in an environment that is very dry or very moist, and this is peaking at an intermediate moist environment. Now, if purple and red were like on top of each other and then kind of disappeared, we could argue that those would be, maybe there's some evidence for them being interdependent. Cool. All right. I think we got that one. And unless anybody has any questions or concerns, we can take our time. Actually, there's a little bit more I want to talk about that. So we talked about, I brought up line transects. So going up the side of a mountain and you go into different ecosystems and watching for species to appear together and disappear together, or appear independently and disappear independently. That's one way that we can look for evidence of interdependent and independent communities. What is a second way that scientists could maybe do a manipulative study to see if a species is independent or interdependent?
If they remove one species and like see what else survives.
Exactly. So they've done this through removal studies. So they've taken, growing organisms together and then growing them separately. And if they die separately but live together, it's pretty clear evidence that they are interdependent. Yeah, exactly. All right. I think that covers number 10 pretty well. Number 11 says, given a food web, identify a potential keystone species and predict the effect of removing this species on the community. And there are some activities from Cogbooks that go over this as well. What do we think of what do we mean when we talk about a keystone species? How would we describe that?
Maybe like an apex predator.
How do they affect the community? Or like as a whole? How do they affect other species in that community? So someone said a species that's important to the health of the environment. I would agree. Let's talk about it like a little more detail. What are some things they could do to help that community? So they could provide a resource. That is true. So if they provide a resource that like multiple other organisms could use. Since they're a predator, or sorry, there's another thing in the chat. Yeah, so a big takeaway is that it's an organism that other organisms in that community depend on. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but a lot of times they are top predators and they will predate on lower level organisms that are in competition with each other. And as long as they switch from predating on one or the other and they keep those competition levels equal, it prevents one species from gaining an advantage over the other, which could lead one species to go extinct. So it can prevent extinctions in the community by controlling levels of competition below it in the food web. It could also has the same effect by being a predator of another organism that's also a predator on lower level organisms. It prevents that maybe super successful predator from wiping out other prey items by keeping that like a mesopredator, a lower level predator in a lower numbers. Yes, so someone said keystone species are there to keep a community intact. Yeah, they keep it intact, they keep it balanced, they keep, well, but also are keystone predators important for diversity, right? It talked about, do they tend to increase or decrease diversity? Yeah, so having keystone species in the environment tends to also increase the diversity of that environment. So not only do they keep it balanced, they keep it diverse. So are there any other questions on keystone species related to food webs and their impacts? So somebody said removing a keystone species will decrease diversity. Yes, that is generally the case too. It's like the example of wolves in Yellowstone. When those were removed, it allowed other mesopredators like coyotes to grow in large numbers, and they killed off a lot of small mammal and bird populations in that environment. But when the wolves were there, they kept the coyote numbers low enough that it gave opportunity for the smaller like prey populations to persist. Yeah, so I guess to sum up, maybe they're generally a predator, top predator. They keep lower levels of competition balanced. they increase diversity of that population. And some members of the community depend on them to persist. All right, let's move to number 12. So it says, given a food web, identify a species that causes apparent competition between two other species and do not consume the same food. So first, why don't we define what apparent competition is? What happens in a scenario of apparent competition? So someone said two species have a negative effect on each other through an enemy. So someone else says causes an outcome that looks like competition, but the underlying mechanism is different. Yeah, I think if we take parts of both of those answers, I think we can get to the answer we want. So the first one, I was going to ask how many minimum organisms are involved, and it's going to be 3, right? Because you have 2 species that appear to be competing, but there's a third species that's actually causing the negative effect on one of the 2 apparent competitors. So the example from Cogbooks was the pheasant and the partridge, right? Where they have overlapping territories, and sometimes the pheasant does really well and the partridge does really poorly, and it looks like the pheasant is a superior competitor. Other times, the pheasant and the partridge do equally well or relatively similar, and people were not understanding why. But does anybody remember what the reason was? What was driving the difference in the partridge and pheasant populations in certain locations? Who was the third party involved? No worries if people didn't get that far. I'll finish the example and you'll eventually get there, right? It was a parasite. So when the parasite load was high, pheasants did okay, but partridges did really poor. When parasite load was low, pheasants did well and partridges did well. So, to the naked eye, researchers initially didn't know that there was a parasite involved, but when they investigated further and looked at physiological or differences at the body, they found, oh, there's a parasite here, but there's not a parasite there. And then they did a manipulative study where they had 2 treatments, where they had one plot where the parasite load was controlled to be low and one plot where it was controlled to be high, and that showed them the difference. And actually, Cogbooks has, for whatever reason, they gave you a figure for this, but not the figure that I would have shown you. I'm going to share real quick to go over the visual. So Cogbooks showed you this figure where it looks at, you have your pheasant parasite load and then your partridge parasite load in the 2 different locations, right? So when in blue is when parasite eggs were the manipulative plot, when they're scattered on the soil, pheasants took up a lot of parasites and partridges didn't take up that many. And when there was no parasites scattered in the soil, both had very low levels. So that's pretty obvious. But what they didn't show you, and I just made up these numbers, but just to show you the trend, if you have your control pheasant and your control partridge, so what happened is they measured survival and body mass. So I just kind of combined them. And you see there's no real difference in body mass or survival when there's low levels of parasites. But when they have an infected pheasant versus an infected partridge, you see that the partridge survival drops off drastically and its body mass also drops off. So I'm a visual person, so I would have liked the Cogbooks to show you this figure of the data to show the actual effect and not just the parasite load, but they describe the effect in the text. So the information is there, but I just thought maybe if we visually saw it, it would be helpful too. And does that make sense, the second figure that I put together? Yeah, so the parasite is the third species. Exactly. That's the, what was it? The underlying mechanism that's driving the difference between the pheasant and their partridge. In this scenario, the pheasant is not out competing the partridge. It's just that the partridge has parasites and deals with them very poorly. So it's the parasite that makes it look like the pheasant is out competing the partridge. Because the partridge and the pheasant have a shared resource in food and space, but they're not, when without parasites, they're surviving equally well together. So will it always be another species? Yes. And then the question is a parasite always the third species? I think that's a great question. Does anybody have an input on that? What could be another example? Besides a parasite, could there ever be a third party that could have an effect on two other species? What is something that has in our ecological interactions, what is something that has a negative effect on another organism? So someone said maybe an animal that eats a plant. Yeah, so it could be, so I would call it maybe what Cogbooks talks about is predation. If they have a shared predator, so say the pheasant and the partridge are in a landscape without predator X, they do equally well. Then all of a sudden predator X moves in and it has a preference for partridges, or partridges are slower and easier prey, so they get eaten at higher rates. So the predator drops the survival of the partridge, right? And then the pheasant is able to escape or just is not hunted. But again, it looks like they're competitors because they're in the same environment and share same resources, but it's the predator that is driving it. Disease would probably fall under parasite, but it's possible that it could be a disease too, right? If, in one area there's no disease, so they do equally well. In another area, they both pick up the plague and the partridge does really poor with it, but the pheasant does well. So I could see an argument for disease working. The other one, an animal that eats plants. If we switch up the species and maybe we have two species of plants, and then there's an herbivore that eats one more than the other, but the plants live together and they do differently in different environments, I could see making an argument for the herbivore being the third party in this scenario. So yeah, that could potentially work too, if these were plants instead of birds. Are there any other questions on apparent competition? All right, if not, I think we can move to 13. And that says, draw on results of a research study to establish one factor that promotes diversity in a community. So first, what are some factors of that environment, of an environment that would increase or promote diversity? There are a few that Cogbooks went over. So someone said abundant resources, exactly, right? If you have abundant resources in an environment, you can generally increase diversity. What's another thing that could increase diversity? We talked about one a few questions ago. So someone else said, yeah, keystone species, exactly. If there's a keystone species in that environment, it's generally going to be at a higher diversity level than if that keystone species is removed. Someone else said diverse habitat, right? I would fully agree. If you have different types of habitats, so like grass versus ponds versus forest, in the same general area, you provide more types of habitat, more types of resources and shelters. That's a good way to promote diversity. And there's another one that we went over in the more towards the beginning of this. Another type of ecological interaction that can promote diversity.
Mutualism?
Yeah, if there's mutualisms in a population, you're probably going to have higher levels of diversity as well. And when it says draw on the results of a research study, so that's just going to be remembering a study from cogbooks. So pay attention to the examples they give you. And as far as the answers go, grading wise, say this is a short answer, focus on the big picture and the patterns. You don't have to know the names of the authors. If you get the species name wrong, that's fine. You can just say there were plants in the study. You don't have to know what kind of plants they are. Or if you can say there's a predator in the study, you don't have to know what species of predator it is. I'm fine with that. So just focus on, the general organisms involved and what the study did and what the study found. That's as detailed, I guess, as I would say I want you to remember from cogbooks. And that could be having you say, describe a study from cogbooks, or it could give you an example of a study, and then based on the description, it could ask you certain questions about what were some of the, maybe what was the resource in the environment, or how did changing one resource affect the diversity of the environment? Are there any other questions on 13? I think this is in the last module. Yeah, so this is in module 4 T18. And then there's a couple parts that it covers. So there's one called abundant resources promote diverse communities. The next one is diverse habitat. So each one of the 4 that we listed are their own section, but it's module 4 T18. All right, the number 14 says contrast interspecific competition and apparent competition. Explain the mechanism for each phenomenon. So this is kind of similar to what we just talked about with, I think we covered apparent competition pretty well. But what is interspecific competition? Who are the players, or what organisms are involved in this? Yeah, so competition between individuals of different species. Exactly, right? So you have interspecific. So you have, species A and species B are going to compete over a shared resource. So what it doesn't ask in this question is, what is intraspecific competition then?
Competition among individuals of the same species?
Yeah, exactly. You have individual 1 from species A and individual 2 from species A. So intra is within, inter is between. And with inter and intra-specific competition, the mechanism is either within species or between species competing for a shared resource. And that competition could be, you know, displays at each other. It could be physical altercations, as we saw the example from the picture of the hippos. And then with a parent competition, just to make sure we're understanding, what is the underlying mechanism in a parent competition again?
Is it a third party that's involving itself with two species?
Yeah, it's the third party, either, you know, could be, we said, the parasite, a predator, potentially disease, or even, you know, an herbivore. The third party is what's driving the apparent competition. It's driving the effect. And when I say effect, that could be anything from like body mass or survival or reproductive output. So you're going to have your two apparent competitors. And then if this is a figure, one is going to drop off when that third party is involved, because it has a negative, more of a negative effect on one organism or species than it does on another species. And usually we don't see all three of them interacting together. So that's why it's not always, you know, obvious that that's what's driving the difference or the effect in the population of the two species. Are there any questions on the different types of competition? And then the last one is kind of just, it's a little bit open-ended, but I think there's some points that we can definitely talk about. So it says, design an experiment to establish whether two species interact through competition, mutualism, predation, herbivory, and then what factors would you manipulate and what patterns would you predict? So what are some key features of any good experiment? What are you, if you have different like groups, yeah, so somebody says controls. What's the counterpart to a control? A manipulation. Yep, you could have you could call it a manipulation group. Oftentimes it's called a treatment group, but usually you have your control and your treatments. And how do those differ? What is a control and what is a treatment? Control, you know the outcome. Do you always know the outcome of a control? I would agree that you have good reasoning to know the outcome of a control. Control is across the board in each group. What does that mean when we say across the board here in this context? So we can think of it as a baseline. A control is what stays the same. Yeah, so it's an unmanipulated or untreated group. So then how would we describe a treatment group? What changes in the experiment? So does anybody want to start maybe just designing a hypothetical experiment? We can pick one of these, you know, competition, mutualism, predation, or herbivory.
Would you be able to have an experiment where you would remove a specific species from an environment?
Yeah, you could do that. The removal could be your treatment, right? And the control would be to leave them there.
Right, like have one area of, I don't know, a field untouched, and then another area of a field treated for a specific bug.
Okay, so in this experiment, we've got two fields, one left untouched is we're gonna call that our control group, right? And then the one where we remove say we remove a bug from something, and maybe we want to look at plant growth, right? That's our objective, is see how we predict that this bug is affecting plant growth because maybe it eats the plant. So if we have our two plots, but what do you want to do with your control plot? Do you want to like just put flags around it and then just walk away? Like, is that all you need to do to make a good control plot, is just to designate the size of the plot?
Yeah, I would think so.
Well, what if there's a handling effect,
Okay.
right? So we're building on this, right? So in a good control is you do everything you do in the treatment plot except apply the treatment. So what you would do in that control plot there is you would go in and you would walk through it like you would in the treatment one, like you're pretending to search out these bugs, and you would maybe grab the bugs, pick them up, handle them, and you would put them back in place. So you want to have the same handling of everything except the final step, right? Another example of this could be, if we want to stick with like vegetation plots, it could be, say you want to add a pesticide to one plot to remove that bug, but in your control plot, you don't want to add that pesticide, but there's other factors. You might go through with the same pesticide applicator and just maybe spray water, right? Because that could be your control. And then the other one, you could mix the pesticide with water and apply it, but so it has water like the other plot, but also the additive treatment of the pesticide. So there, in your control plot, you still need to have some handling, just not the same, the final manipulation you're interested in. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Well, what would like going through the plot and picking up the bugs do? Would it just be maybe like being touched by humans would affect the way they live, or?
That is actually more concern for the plant. So you would be disturbing the plant when you remove the bugs, right? And remember in that one, we were measuring plant growth. So we want to know if going in and disturbing the plant by removing the bug and then leaving the bug there, like, does that fit, does handling the plant a little bit and bothering it, does that have a negative effect on its growth? And it's not the bug. So it's a way to kind of rule out that it's the only thing different is the bug. So if we see a difference, we can say it for sure is the bug. And it's not necessarily, maybe it's part of the bug, maybe it's disturbance.
Right. Okay.
Or even like the human scent, like, that's why you want to like handle the control in the same manner you handle the treatment without applying that treatment. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes.
Okay. All right, so somebody. Okay, so somebody had another example in saying mutualism, adding two species together versus them separate and evaluating their fitness. Yeah, I think that along those lines, we could make an experiment work. If we want, how would we go into that experiment? How would we test if it's a mutualism? So would the control be together? Yeah, I would say the control would have two species that we assume to be mutualists together. But again, with the control, say we find forest A and forest B, and we're calling those our two plots, and the species exist together in both forests. And we go to forest B and we remove one of the species that we're interested in. What do we have to do for the control forest? Do we just ignore it and just say that's it? Well, if we removed it, wouldn't it be the same as the treatment plot? Okay, I mean, I think this is a good example and a good conversation, because I think here, what we would do is we would have 3 plots would be the best experiment, right? We would have 2 treatment plots. In treatment plot 1, we would remove species A, and in treatment plot 2, we would remove species B, and in the control plot, we would leave them together, but we would do what with the control plot? we would go into the control plot and physically do something, but what would our action be? We're removing one species in one treatment and another species in a second treatment. But we have to be concerned about our disturbance. Not necessarily add another factor, but do some of the work in the treatment. Yeah, replicate the stress. You could word it that way. I would go into the control plot, find some species A, handle them like we would pretend to put them in like a bucket or however we're removing them, and then put them back, find some species B, pick them up, handle them like we would in the treatment, put them back, right? So we want to have our presence there, walking through it as a disturbance, handling both species separately as a disturbance, but ultimately leaving it. So we just add that stress or that disturbance factor, and that's our control. And then we just do the removal treatments in the other plots. So this one would have one control plot with handling of the species, but leaving them there. And then it would have two treatment plots where we would remove one species from plot 1 and the other species from plot B, so let's say, and then we would control the growth of something or the reproduction of something from all 3 plots. And what would we predict if this was a mutualism for our control and for our 2 treatments? Let's say the example are plants, right? We removed plant A from one plot and plant B from another plot and left them together in a third plot. How would we expect their reproduction to do in the 3 plots? Would we predict the control plot to be highest? Okay, so somebody said, predict they are mutual, but reproduction doesn't change since they don't depend on one another. But part of a mutualism is that they have a positive effect. I think the control plot would be highest, somebody said, and I would agree with that, right? So if the control plot would likely have the highest plant growth because they're together receiving each other's benefits. And the other 2 plots, we have 2 questions we can ask. If we get a result where the plant growth is low, but they survive, what kind of relationship would we call that? What kind of mutualism benefits the 2 organisms, but their lives don't depend on it? Remember from previous? Would that be the facultative mutualism, exactly, right? And if we had our control plot that did well and lived, and our results were the 2 treatment plots died, what kind of relationship would we call that?
Obligate mutualism?
Yeah, that would be, I think, pretty clear evidence for an obligate mutualist relationship. Yeah, so if you have an exam question similar to this, that's the kind of level of detail for maybe a short answer. You would need to state what your controls are, what your treatments are, how you handle your treatments and your controls, and what your hypotheses are and why, and what types of results would support and what types of results would not support your hypotheses. Are there any other questions about maybe designing an experiment and talking about factors that you could manipulate and patterns that you would predict? If not, that covers all of the questions from the learning materials. Are there any questions that anybody had still that are not from these learning materials that we wanted to discuss or go over? Or any questions about the upcoming exam or previous, well, maybe not previous exams, we can talk about that individually. Somebody said question 13. Find that. So that's going to be. That's going to be a few of the parts from Cogbooks. So the first one is, this is the abundant resources promote diversity. I remember the example they gave here was they looked at the different productivity shapes and looked at, across species, so aquatic vertebrates, aquatic invertebrates, aquatic plants. And just noticed that, the more abundant resources were in an environment, the more productivity or diversity that environment had. And there's a couple examples here I would read through, and you might be able to recall or have to recall some of the results from these studies. So just know what, the general pattern is that habitat diversity increases diversity. And then these parts explain some studies and why that habitat diversity increases diversity. And the same thing, actually, sorry, this is abundant resources, but habitat diversity is its own section. That has some more figures as well, and some explanations about why diverse habitats promote diverse communities. Having more resources and more structure allows, for more different types of organisms with different needs. And then there's another section about keystone species and how they promote diversity in the communities. Remember, a key with keystone species is that they control levels of competition at trophic levels below them. Other species often depend on them. They provide services for certain species. So there's a lot of benefits to keystone species and why they are able to promote diversity. Does that work for helping with 13, or is there more questions about that one? Cool. Any other questions then? If not, that's cool. We can call it a session. I think we got a lot done tonight, so it's great. And if you have any questions, during Cogbooks, feel free to write any questions on the support question on the bottom of each page if you want, or send me an email, or I'm available via communication before the exam yet. So. All right, I think then we'll go ahead. I will make an announcement. I have to take a look at my schedule if I can fit in another office hours on Monday. So I'm not positive right now, to be fair. All right, yep, no problem. Thank all of you again for participating. I think we'll go ahead and call it a session.